Well, welcome all to our conversation about music in American lives. My name is Seth Green, and especially on an afternoon like this one, I'm grateful to say that I'm the dean here at the University of Chicago's Graham School. Before jumping into a conversation with Annie Gennaro Randall, who is a leader in the subject that we will be talking about and an upcoming instructor for those who are thinking about their autumn courses, I'll just share the nutshell for those of you who are not yet familiar with the Graham School. You should be. We are the home of lifelong learning and leadership. We are one of the founding divisions of this University of Chicago because when William Rainey Harper and John D. Rockefeller were imagining the university, they wanted it to reach people across all ages and stages of their lives. And to this day, we commit to that mission of bringing the incredible intellectual assets of this university to people across all ages and stages. We have three primary initiatives that we do that through: the basic program, where people can read great books; the Master of Liberal Arts, where you can engage in advanced study at a graduate level across all disciplines of the university; and the Leadership and Society initiative for people that are thinking about really ambitious next chapters. And alongside those initiatives, we have what we call open enrollment, where we bring a really wonderful array of disciplines from across the university to our incredible learners. And that is where we find ourselves this afternoon, in conversation with one of those open enrollment instructors for this autumn. And so with that, I'm going to take down my screen so that you can see our guest today. Annie Gennaro Randall is a musicologist who has taught at undergraduate and postgraduate interdisciplinary arts and humanities courses at universities across our country. She holds a PhD in musicology from the College Conservatory of Music in Ohio, a master's in music composition from DePaul University, and a BA in early modern European history from University of Kent in England. She has published 3 books and 18 peer-reviewed articles on topics ranging from opera to 1960s British pop and US protest music, which we'll talk more about today. She is a former editor of Music and Culture series at Wesleyan University Press and the past vice president of the International Association for the Study of Popular Music. She received the American Musicologist Society's Philip Brett Book Award for Dusty Queen of the Postmoderns, which she published with Oxford University in 2009. And she has received distinguished alumna awards from DePaul and from the University of Cincinnati. We are very grateful to now also add to your role, a role here teaching at the Graham School. So thank you so much, Annie, for joining us today.
Seth, I want to add one, because we're, under the auspices of university. Book I published was University of Chicago Press.
All right. The most important detail
Yes.
that I did not add in. So a longstanding affiliation with us and a new
Yes.
role here. Well, so let's jump in. You're going to be teaching a course. It's going to be just like the title of this conversation, about the role of music in Americans' lives. And we're going to look at how it plays out in movements. How did you originally imagine this class, and why did you see an opportunity for inquiry at this intersection of music and social movements?
Okay. I think it's important to clarify where I'm coming from, that even though I'm trained as a musicologist, and that would imply, heavy duty music theory, music history. Of course, the ology part of it implies almost a scientific approach. But I'm definitely coming at this as an artist, as a musician. And I think that's really important to clarify at the beginning, because that's exactly how I teach the course, is as an artist who makes music and who has made music my entire life, observing historical actors making music for a particular reason. Much more interesting when you think about it in that active sense, of people who, of course, are long gone now, but when they were alive, say in the 17th, I really love to imagine them making music and thinking, why did they do this? Why did they create this special defines them as a particular group against the vast set of groups? So that was my initial entry into the topic. You know, I had always been interested in quote unquote American music, but the more I got into it, the more I realized there wasn't any particular American music. There were many musics in America. So that's another different way of looking at things that opens up the field completely as to what you're going to look at.
Well, so let's jump in. So, one of the core ideas of the course, Annie, is that across history, there are groups that have deliberately used music to identify themselves as distinct. And, I'd love to glimpse into some of the examples of the course. And as we do so, I'd love to explore what was that group's intention? And then
Mm-hmm.
how did it play out? And, how did they express themselves through music, dance, and more? And so maybe we can start with the Shakers, who I know are early in your course. And can you tell us more about that group, where they fit in history, and then why and how they harness the power of music? And what we're going to do over the course of this conversation is we're going to look at a number of the kind of case studies that take place in this course, only a sampling because there are different ones each week, but we're going to look at a few of them and we're going to play out this idea of groups that are using music towards some kind of movement, whether that is a distinct social movement or more of a broader way of identifying and branding themselves in the context of a changing world. But let's start with the Shakers and kind of run through these questions of who were they? What were they intended? And how did they use music? How did it go?
Sure. I noticed a couple of messages in the chat about the connection. I don't know that there's anything I can do about that at this point. I hope it resolves itself.
I hope so too. There have been a couple of breaks, but you are coming through nonetheless with great excitement and clarity. So I
Okay.
say we keep going and we'll hope that the Zoom gods are on our side.
1750s, 60s, and 70s. If we go to Manchester, England, we'll find a group of Quakers and then a separatist group from the Quakers called the Shakers. And one of the reasons they were called Shakers is because they adopted this very distinctive man that to outside observers looked like they were just randomly shaking, but of course they weren't. And deliberate. They also engaged in a type of dancing that we might today identify as trance dancing. And obviously, if you know anything about Quakers, this is, the opposite end of the spectrum to a Quaker meeting. This is something where you're standing up, you're making noise, you're dancing, you're shaking, quote unquote, shaking, when you are receiving what they called the gift from God, the gift of salvation. Dancing and singing. It was the receipt of the gift. So the other belief that is central is that they believed in the second coming of Christ. And they believed, hold on to your hats here, they believed that Mother Ann Lee, who was one of their group, was the second coming of Christ at that particular point in time. To have a woman leader of a religious group struck me as being incredibly fascinating, incredibly unique, radical in just every sense of the word. So their set of musical practices, their dancing, their belief system, their desire to create a utopia where their beliefs could flourish without persecution it's important to note that they were persecuted and they were ostracized. Hence, their decision by Mother Ann Lee to come to North America. And this was before the Revolutionary War, so it's still not considered the United States. It's colonial North America. And they land in New York and they start making a colony in New York. They traveled to Massachusetts, but I believe it was Watervliet, New York, that was their principal settlement when they first arrived in North America. And that was right at the onset of the Revolutionary War. So the picture is how radical they were, how convinced they were of the rightness of their belief, that just took them through this very perilous journey across the ocean. And I should say, too, they were not wealthy people by any means. They were, I would just categorize them as poor. They really just didn't have much money. So they scraped together whatever money they had, got on the ship to America and started a colony, or started a settlement, I should say, which was this utopian setting, a utopian agrarian setting. Simplicity is the other key word for their belief system. Everything went to the gift coming from God, and all their work as well. The idea of material in this world was completely foreign to them. They weren't interested in acquisition of material wealth at all. And another key factor in their belief system, equality. They believed in equality of the genders. They had female leaders right from the beginning. And among all ethnic groups and races, they were quite radical in accepting everyone into the fold right from the beginning. And this is in the 1770s in this utopian community. Let me pause there because I don't want to just rattle on. Seth, do you want to interrupt and ask me
Yeah,
something?
I mean, so I think if that is how we understand the Shakers, let's go to the other side of this, right? Which is, so how does that play out in music, and how do they? I mean, I think a lot of the examples that we talked about in our prep is they're using music intentionally,
Yes,
and they have a vision for how music is going to help them to communicate who they are. And so here's a group, they're breaking away from the Quakers. They're trying to define a whole new identity and way of life. And so tell us about how they use music as a vehicle toward that end. What's their intention? What does that show up as in the music? And then how does that play out? Does it work? Essentially,
exactly.
is music effective as a tool for them to tell their story of difference and distinction?
Yes, like everything in their lives, music reflected their beliefs. So the music itself was radically. Oh, I see a note there. Yes, we can hear a snippet. I've got one queued up for you. Radically simple, rejecting the very elaborate, ornate, complex music of the high church at that time. I don't know if anyone in the audience is a churchgoer, but you probably know what I mean. With the organ, with the full choir, sometimes with orchestra, that type of religious music was at the opposite end of the spectrum. So if you have on the one hand, the high Christian tradition of orchestra, chorus, the whole 9 yards. And then on the other hand, you have the Shakers, where they're never singing in harmony, first of all. It's always just one line of melody. So you can't get much simpler than that. I guess if you were to get more simple, it would be complete silence, so you just have one melody, everyone's singing the same melody. The melody is deliberately simple so that everyone can sing it, so that the range is going to be very narrow. You're not going to get up into the high soprano, not going to get into the low bass range. You're going to keep everything in the middle so everyone can sing it, everyone can participate. The words are always directed to the message. Almost every song mentions the gift, and the gift is central. What the gift is a very kind of mystical thing for the Shakers. So almost every song mentions the gift. It mentions being saved. It mentions simplicity. And another wonderful thing that they talk about is turning. And that has to do with their dances, their circular dances where they're turning, turning, turning. The whole idea in Shaker, turn toward salvation. And that is a choice. Where you come from, if you decide to make that choice to turn toward the gift, then you certainly will get the gift. And it's open to everyone. Very egalitarian. Should I play this snippet? Because I
Yeah,
think this.
please do. And then we're going to go into some of the other case studies, but let's hear this
Sure.
example.
I have a feeling I chose this because I think everyone will be familiar with it and maybe didn't know that it came from the Shakers. It's the song, yes, Suzanne K, Simple Gifts. Exactly right. So let me share my screen. I've got the audio queued up properly, and here it is.
And when we find ourselves in the
I'm going to go.
Tis the gift to be simple, tis the gift to be free. Come down where we ought to be, and when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. Tis the gift to be simple, tis the gift to be free, tis the gift to come down where we ought to be, and when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, to turn will be our delight, till by turning we come round right.
I think I'll stop.
Wonderful. Well, so I think you've given us a very clear example of how this group, in the context of its history, defines itself, then uses music, in this case, to your point, the turning towards salvation. It is able to bring that into a public sphere in some ways through song and to tell this story. So I want to just pick at a couple other glimpses into your course where you're looking at other examples of groups that are doing something similar. And I want to turn, a little bit later in time now to enslaved African Americans in the U.S. who are using spirituals and who are also trying to both tell stories to one another, but also pass down information. Can you give us kind of context and then talk about how they use music?
Yeah, all of the topics in this course are absolutely fascinating because they're not completely the same. The
Right.
people who are making the music are coming from different circumstances. And that's most obvious when you're talking about enslaved men and women making music. So, however, there's a few things that do connect them. The groups that I'm looking at, I should say we're looking at, because it's always a shared exploration with the students. The three groups that would be the Shakers, the Shoshone, tribe who created the ghost dance, and then the enslaved individuals in the South on plantations, though their music is very different to listen to, they had a, in that they acknowledged where they were. And in the case of all three, at some point, it wasn't a happy circumstance. It was very tough to be a Shaker, or extremely tough, obviously, to be an enslaved person in the South, and extremely tough to find your people the object of, genocidal US Army, the Shoshone, all of these very tough circumstances. The music acknowledges that they are there. They want to make music in the present, but the music also takes them somewhere else. And I think that's so interesting, how they deliberately are trying to transport themselves from the present moment. And they do it through the music. You could escape, and that would be, like the simplest sort of explanation or way of looking at it. I think it's more than that. It's more than an escape, specific location that can't be seen. It's a place of freedom, a place of liberation, a place where they're not being hounded or tortured or persecuted. So the three, I said, that are the earliest in this class, the Shakers, the Shoshone tribe out west, and the enslaved individuals in the American South, they do share this, even though the sound of the music is very different. I just find this endlessly fascinating. So to the creation of spirituals and how it identified their creators. I think most people realize that the creative as end of enslavement was very much circumscribed by the plantation owners. They did not want the enslaved individuals to communicate with each other. Hence the banning of drumming, which was felt to be a kind of secret form of communication that could travel over long period or vast distances. And then, of course, the restriction of singing, which could have been in different languages that the plantation owners didn't understand. It could have hidden meanings. So enslaved populations were allowed to sing Christian hymns. That was allowed. Enslaved individuals did was take the Christian hymns and then completely transform them into something of their own creation. And what we see happening with the spirituals is a completely new way of singing.
Can you share an example with us?
Yeah, I can. I should preface this by saying this is a very famous singer who was classically trained. This is Paul Century. And the way he's singing is kind of a middle ground where he's singing from his classically trained perspective, but he's also trying to reference the soulful singing of the originators of, in his case, it would be the ancestors. So let me share this, and it's always better to hear it, right? About it. Okay. I'm just checking to make sure I've got the audio optimized. Yeah, okay, here we go.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that.
No, not at all. Well, so I want to just put one more example out there, and then I want to make sure we get to the many questions populating the chat. You also look in the later part of the course at explicitly political movements. So obviously, there are political implications of all of the earlier examples that we've talked about. But in this particular sense, these groups intended their music to advance a political goal versus in the earlier examples, they may have served culturally as the intention and then it impacted all these other spheres. And so I want to now look at least two examples with you, which is the songs of abolition and then the songs of women's suffrage, because I know both of those are covered in the course. And so can you talk about how each of those examples come into existence, the role that music plays in these movements, and maybe your assessment of was music effective, as far as we can tell, as a vehicle in achieving certain political outcomes?
There's so many sections to that. Let me go to function first.
Yeah.
The songs were meant, as you put it, certainly correctly, a political point of view. So that was the principal value, was to gain followers, to gain people to their side. The quickest way they could do that was to take existing popular songs. And while you're listening to this, everyone, you can think of something in your mind that would be a very popular song today. They took existing popular songs that they thought everyone would know, and then they would put their own words to it. This was the go-to. Very few abolition and suffrage songs were newly composed. The vast majority of them were this kind of hijacking your own words to it. Why this was effective is that the songs were simple, so people, and they were catchy because they were pop songs, so they're very memorable, but they're also able to, when you do your, communicate your point of view, poetic way, you can use poetic imagery instead of, and remember, you're talking to a population, many of whom can't read. So there has to be some kind of other way to get these ideas across. The reading population is fine. You can publish those lyrics and everyone can learn them. But what about the non-reading population? So the function of these songs is, or the efficacy of these songs is rather incredible. So did anybody come up with a popular song that maybe we could use as an example? Patriotic songs were very popular. Like, in fact, taking the national anthem and then putting abolition lyrics to it, or taking the national anthem and putting suffrage lyrics to it. There are some versions that are jaw-dropping because the lyrics are so direct and so revealing of a certain moment in American history. Of course, we don't, the point is clear that that's how they did it. And by, as their vehicle, they were deliberately situating themselves in their time, in the popular culture of their time. They're saying, we're not of the past, we're not of the future, we're of right now. And this is what we want to do. And my song is going to tell you. Know who I am. You know I'm an abolitionist. You know I'm a suffragist.
Well, so I want to begin coming to some of the questions in the chat, and I'm going to come back to one from George Trevino from earlier. He says, my interest, besides why certain genres were created, is how did they come up with the style? That is a hard question, though, relying on individual creativity, but throughout the decades, the 60s, 70s, there was a lot of creativity. Can you talk, Annie, about how maybe one or more of the groups that we've already glimpsed into specifically designed the style of the music? I mean, you gave, I think, in the examples of the political, this real focus on pop that has the already existing community of, adherents, so that, if I'm a Taylor Swift fan, then, use that music and, you've got me from the moment that, I can hear that beat, right? But talk about maybe in those first two, how did they come up with the style? And was it intentional, like the African American spirituals or the Shakers, or was it something that was organic and evolved over time, or a mix of those two?
Great question. I think if we think about the Shakers, theirs was a style that was consciously rejecting the high church style of their time. So they basically stripped away layers. They stripped away instruments. They stripped away harmony. And they stripped it right down to just the single melody that everybody sings. So that's the distinguishing feature of their musical style. So that's how that happened. With the Shoshone was taken from traditional Shoshone music. It was put to a different purpose, which was the ghost dance, which was supposed to bring back the dead ancestors. There was a belief that when the Shoshone did their ghost dance with the singing, there was the belief that the dead ancestors would come back. The ones, of course, who had been killed by the US Army. There was a belief that the bison would come back. And there was also a belief that special shirts would shield them from bullets. And all of this was part of the dancing and the singing that came from traditional Shoshone history. So that's where that style came from. It came directly from the tribe and the tribal practices historically. And in the case of the creation of spirituals, the style is such a hybrid that could only happen in the United States because it has features that are found in African singing, West African singing specifically, from places such as Ghana and Nigeria, all the countries on West Africa that populated the slave trade. You have aspects of call and response. You have the rhythmic element that can come from body percussion. It doesn't need to come from drums. It can come from, clapping, stamping, making other sounds called body percussion. And of course, issue that the enslaved populations were not speaking mentioned, and then gradually created their own form of speaking English, some of which is still preserved today. For instance, in the Gullah Islands off of North and South Carolina, there you can hear that kind of hybrid language. So there are elements of African music making and language, but also the hybrid comes from the musical style of Christian hymns. Again, only in America could this happen. And then, of course, you have the singing style, which is very hard to characterize in language, honestly, because I think when you put language to it, it almost makes it small, because you're thinking of the enslaved individuals and why they are singing. They're transporting themselves somewhere else. And the style of singing is what does that.
Hmm.
So in terms of George's question, that's what I have right now in terms of where the style comes from.
We have a question from Joy about, whether this form of music makes it into your course. In particular, will the course continue to rap music, which is a genre that reflects a culture, a style with creativity heavily imbued with percussion? Do you cover rap? Why or why not?
Wonderful question. And I have left myself all kinds of wiggle room. Seth, cover your ears. And Zoe, cover your ears.
We believe in wiggle room, and we believe in small classes where you can be responsive to students' interests. So I'm guessing my ears will be energized by what you say. Keep going.
Good, because I've left myself wiggle room to put in different units. And this, of course, does depend on some of the desires of the students taking the class. The idea of putting rap in is wonderful. I love it. And it would completely fit with the sort of themes of the class, of a group of people in a particular place and time who are identifying themselves through a distinct musical practice. What could be more perfect than the origins of rap? It would be perfect. So the answer is yes.
Suzanne, can we talk a little bit more about the African-American spirituals? There's a question here about, not all enslaved people speaking English.
Right.
They also were not necessarily allowed to use other language, not allowed to sing. Can you talk a little bit about how they approached that, how these were developed in many ways, as I understand it from you, kind of undercover because of the limitations, and just talk about how some of the evolution of this music really comes out of that context of, their limitations, but it ends up enabling in some ways some really incredible creativity.
Yeah. Again, the issue of language, absolutely correct, that from the first importation of the transatlantic slave trade in 1619, you do have generations of enslaved people who simply do not speak English. They're speaking their native languages, obviously. So the musical practices are traveling along with the language.
Right.
The part about it being suppressed is exactly right. And what we have are on plantations. Often they were the subversive relatives of plantation owners. I'm thinking of the Grimke family, who were big plantation owners, but they had radical members of their families who were radical abolitionists. And they would come to the plantation of their relative and take copious notes about how the enslaved population on that plantation was treated, what their practices were, and indeed singing. These kinds of eyewitness accounts tell us that a lot of this singing that was not designed for the master, so to speak, took place in secret in a place that would be shrouded from view by bushes or other greenery. And it was called the Sacred Bower. It came to be called that. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, we have issues of language and also the idea that the music itself was suppressed and had to be conducted in.
So another question in the chat, and it relates to several for it, are around kind of how music in this kind of origin, often from a cultural group, then shifts over time. And in particular, in this example, they're asking about how these spirituals might come ultimately into Christianity and how those kind of worlds become connected in some ways through music.
Great question again. You know, their origins have the strain of Christianity right from the get-go, because it's that hybridity
Right.
that we spoke about a moment ago, is that the enslaved populations were hearing Christian hymns, and that kind of meshed with the African practices and language that they already had. So there's already that element of Christianity there. However, later, as you heard in the Paul Robeson example, you noticed perhaps the presence of piano.
Right.
That certainly wasn't in the Sacred Bower. And what you see in the early 20th century is this classicize spirituals and to make them Christian musical form that could be performed by the entire population of Christians. In other words, what I'm talking about is 4-part harmony. Again, those of you who are churchgoers, you'll recognize what I'm talking about. Soprano, alto, tenor, bass, that kind of thing, arrangements like that, or like what you just heard, arrangements for solo voice and piano that looks like a sacred aria. Starts to look like something more classical. So I don't know if I'm understanding the question exactly right, but this is where I see the Christianity and the spirituals really meeting up in the early 20th century when they were classicized.
Well, so we are coming up to time, Annie. Final question for you. You are going to cover a lot of time chronologically in this course, hundreds of years. You are going to engage multiple disciplines because you're looking at history, at music, at culture, at psychology, right? So you're covering a lot of time, a lot of disciplines. You're doing both music and textual analysis. Can you just walk us through your approach to teaching this course and how you're going to be able to cover so much over the 8 weeks of open enrollment courses?
Yeah, I don't know if anybody felt this while you were talking, Seth, but when you were kind of enumerating the different disciplines, maybe someone's head was starting to explode. Sometimes my own does when I'm preparing for class. Always how I pull myself back is the music.
Yeah.
Always how I pull my overwhelming, that sense of being overwhelmed by so many disciplines. The very first point of entry is always listening, and then asking the students, what are we actually hearing? Right? Let's just get all the other stuff out of the way and let's listen to what would be the primary source, right? And I know that's a value at Chicago, right?
It is.
It's the primary source, and I love that. In this case, the music is the primary source. So we spend a lot of time listening. Our questions come from that. Very much kind of like what we've done today, sort of, you know, where we've had a little bit of explanation, a little bit of exposition, but then listening to the music and then really wanting more. I don't know if the listeners feel that, but I always want more of that music and I want to listen to a lot of it. So that's basically what we do. We start from the music and we unspool the questions from there. And I do have secondary sources. I do want people to know that there are secondary sources, but I don't start with them.
Well, I do want to say a huge thank you. This is a fascinating and important conversation. I think a lot of times we look at these kind of core issues without thinking about the role that different attributes play. And so, you know, we think a lot about movements, we think a lot about in history, you know, suffrage and abolition, but we really rarely look deeply at some of these key vehicles by which those movements take shape and ultimately have impact. And so I'm so grateful that we now have an opportunity to go deep into music across time and space and think about its distinct role. And I'll just say that, as you know, we're very proud here at the University of Chicago to have a real commitment to musicology and to have a deep bench of faculty and now instructors who are really moving this field forward. So thank you for being among them, Annie, and thank you for your forthcoming contributions to our students in the class this autumn. And thank you all for joining us. Apologies for a few, IT interruptions here, but hopefully the core ideas have come through and you feel the energy of the conversation. Have good afternoons to everyone.
Seth, let me thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for everyone for being here.
have great days. Thank you again, Annie.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone. Bye.